Now I'm going to again Shift T to take that instrument track out, and I'm actually going to F3 to open up the console and remove these other two instruments out of here. Free up our processor a bit. I'll close out the console. Let's come to the browser and bring in our Mojito. So Mojito is a basic monophonic subtractive synthesizer that, like my Thai, can be used to create leads and basses and also effects sounds. So let's go ahead and cover the areas here. This won't take us too long. We basically have four main sections. We have our oscillator controls here. We have our filter controls, effects, and our amp section. Then we have a smaller area for working with our portamento settings. Now we can choose our presets from up above here. There's a few to choose from, but I'm actually going to just leave it on this default setting here. And let's start with our oscillator section. We have pitch control here. So I'll go ahead and play back. Pretty straightforward. We can control the pitch of our oscillator. We then have our waveform type, and that's right now set to saw, but we can also move this dial all the way over to a square. So if I play back and move this, we can hear that adjustment. And then when we're in the square mode, we can adjust its width with this control here. So okay, next to that we have LFO control. So we can apply modulation to any of these parameters, the pitch, wave, or width, by using the dials down below. These will essentially control the amplitude and polarity of our modulation. So say we'd like to control or modulate the width of our square. I'll go ahead and move this to the right. And we can control the speed of that modulation with this dial here. Okay, and we can choose whether this is going to be in hertz, or we can choose to have it sync up to the tempo of our song based on whatever resolution that we choose by clicking on the window here or using the dial down below as we've seen. Now finally we have a sub oscillator, so this will introduce some low frequencies to our sound. Now over to the right we have our filter controls, so typical filter cutoff, our resonance, we've got a drive control, then we've got key tracking for our filter cutoff and velocity control that will also control the amount of cutoff that's being applied to our oscillator. We can choose to have the filter cutoff respond to our envelope, our amp envelope. We can also have the cutoff be modulated by our LFO here. So we can control the speed. And then as with our oscillator section, we can choose whether this is going to be synced up with the tempo of our song or in hertz. Now at the bottom we have a few basic effects controls, so we can adjust the depth of our sound. Let me control click to take our LFO modulation back to its default. Okay, we have color, and then we have drive. Okay, so this is a pretty basic device, but you can still experiment and get some cool sounds with here. And again, it's more so for basses, leads, and creating effects sounds. That is our Mojito. And let me actually just close this out and Shift T to remove our instrument track. Let's come to our browser, and next in line we have presence. Let me drag that in. And I'll close out the browser. Now, as with all of the other VSTs, we have our preset section here, so we can choose any instrument, or whether it's going to be a bass, brass, guitar. We have strings, vintage keys, so a variety of things. And what is going to show up here is going to be based on the version of Studio One that you have. So I'm using professional. So there's quite a few to choose from here. If you're working with artists, this may be a bit more slim for you. Now, as with the Mai Tai, it may seem like there's a lot going on here, but we can break this down by section. We've got 2 LFOs, which, as we saw in Mai Tai, we can activate and deactivate by clicking on the titles. We have a filter section. We have a display area in the center here that's going to show the currently loaded patch, and we don't have anything loaded at the moment, as well as the number of voices that are being played back and any key articulations that are available for the chosen patch. Below our LFOs, we have some sample controls here, and to the right we have our amp envelope, and then a freely assignable envelope 2 here, which we can use the modulation matrix to assign that to different parameters within presence. We have some global controls for volume, velocity, and glide as well. Now at the bottom, just as we saw with our Mai Tai, we have a modulation matrix panel with effects, as well as our virtual keyboard. We've seen how these function, so I won't go back into those. I'll go ahead and actually close out the virtual keyboard, as well as the mod and effects panel. You can just see we have effects A and B, exact same effects available as with the Mai Tai, and then our modulation matrix. I'll go ahead and hide that panel, and let's pull our presence down a bit. And let's actually load a patch to get something going on in here. Maybe I'll load string, say a cello, the cello full. And we can see that activity going on there while it loads. We can see the size of our sample as well. So at this point, I should be able to go ahead and play back. Okay, and so that is our cello full sample. And we can see here that it looks like our LFO1 is active on our sample. So if we go ahead and expand out that modulation matrix, we can see that LFO1, which is here, has been assigned to the pitch. Just a subtle amount of amplitude and adjustment being made to that. If we increase that, our modulation wheel is actually assigned. And actually, since these are both together, the modulation wheel is going to control the amount of our LFO. So that's why after making this initial adjustment and moving the amplitude all the way to the right, we didn't hear that. We do need to engage that modulation wheel to hear the LFO1. So again, let me actually open up the virtual keyboard so you can see as I'm adjusting the modulation wheel, that LFO is being introduced. I'll play back. And I'll close out that virtual keyboard and the modulation panel. So we won't spend too much time with the presence. Just know that it is a sample player, and basically you can choose from a variety of different instruments as we've seen, and just load these in. If you're looking for a piano sound, we can access that here. And so we can just load up a full acoustic piano. Okay, and don't forget that we have the effects. So if we wanted to put a bit of reverb on our piano, we can just go ahead and click on the title here to activate that. And I'll go ahead and deactivate the reverb and close out our mod panel. And the final device that we're going to take a look at is Sample XT. So again, I will Shift T to remove that track out, and we'll come to our browser and load up our sample one. Now, Sample 1 XT is different from Presence in that we can actually load our own samples into here, and this is almost kind of a hybrid of a sampler and synthesizer into one. And we can even sample in real time. So if we had a guitar or any instrument that we would like to sample, we can use the record mode here and make any recordings like so. And we'll come back to that in just a second. Now, as you can see at the bottom, we have our familiar modulation or effects panel here. We don't have modulation, the modulation panel, but we have effects A and effects B that we can choose from. And as we saw, clicking on the title, we can activate any of these effects to use within Sample 1 XT. We can hide that effects panel by clicking there. And we have our virtual keyboard that we've seen with our modulation and pitch bend wheels and the bend amount, which we can set there. So we actually don't need to have that open. I'll go ahead and close that out to save a bit of screen real estate. So if we have any sounds that we'd like to work with in Sample 1 XT, we can come to our browser. I'll come to the Files tab, and let's see, what can I bring in here? I'll come to the Field Samples and Instruments. We've got a couple piano chords being played. So loading within or into Sample 1 is just as simple as click and drag, and then that loads in, and we can see the waveform within our display here. We have a sample list that's going to show you every sample that's loaded, and you can get quite a few into Sample 1. I believe it's around 96 that you can actually load into here. Now, if we were to click and drag another sample onto our display, it's going to replace the previous one. So if we would like to add more than one, we need to drag the second one into the sample list area, and then we can see we have both of these that have been added. In order to edit and tweak the individual sample, you just want to be sure that you select it within the sample list area. If you'd like to remove, you can right click and then just choose to remove the sample. We also have remove all, which I'll choose. Can go ahead and continue. And I'm going to bring the piano chords back in. So as with the impact, we have our waveform display window, which we can click and drag up and down to view. We have those familiar markers where we can control what portion of our sample will actually play back when it's triggered. So if I move these borders around this first area, we're going to have very limited playback of our sample. And if you notice here, that sample is mapped across the keys on our MIDI controller, and it's going to be pitched up and down as we play up and down the keyboard, and that sample will play back slower or faster depending on where you're playing on the keyboard. So if I play higher, let me go ahead and extend this out to include all of the sample. That's playing back pretty quickly. Okay, and then as we play lower, it plays back slower. If your audio file has BPM data encoded into it, then you can click the follow song tempo, and it's not going to slow down or speed up. The pitch will change, but the time stretch algorithm will be applied so that the timing remains the same when you make use of the follow song tempo. But your sample does need to have BPM data encoded in it. Now we can choose to normalize our sample, reverse it. And actually, this is normalized here. For the trigger mode, we can choose normal, one shot, and toggle. And in the center area, we can see the file name here. We have our right and left arrows where we can navigate to the previous and next files that are contained within the folder that we've pulled this sample from. So in my instruments folder, we can use these arrows to navigate instead of continuing to drag if we'd like to experiment with the different sounds. Now, when we drag a sample in, it's going to be placed on a root note by default that will be set to C3, and its playback range will be set to a low of minus C2, and the high will be G8. And we can click into these fields and manually enter in a value or press a key on our MIDI controller, and that will automatically populate with that key that we press. We can do that for any of these fields here. We also have a mapping editor where we can see our root key on C3, and we can come to either end of this blue bar and then adjust the playback range for our sample. I'll come back to the wave tab. Now at the bottom of our display, we can actually set up a loop here. By default, it's set to off. But if I were to choose, say, ping pong, for instance, we now have this bracket where we can choose the area that will loop. And so it's set to ping pong. That will go back and forth. So if I go ahead and press a key and hold that, it will go ahead and loop until I release. But I'm going to go ahead and turn that off. We then have a crossfade that we can use. We already saw follow song tempo. We have start and end fields. These tie in with the markers, and they'll update to reflect the current position of our marker. And if we need to make fine adjustments, say to alleviate any pops or clicks, we can use our mouse wheel to make fine adjustments here. We have an all notes off, so if you have a long sample that's continuing to play back and you'd like to stop that, you can just click on that. At the bottom, we have our pitch section, filter, amp, and LFO, and then our global master volume, as well as our voice control. By default, we can play back up to 32 voices. If I click, hold, and drag that up, we can see we can have a maximum of 64 voice playback. I'll Control click to take that back to the default of 32. Now in our pitch section here, we can transpose in semitones. I'm just going to press the same key here. Okay, pretty straightforward. I'll control click to set that back. We then have tuning by sense. We have ADSR controls for our pitch. We then have the filter section, which we can activate by clicking on the lead. And then we have a variety of filters to choose from here: low pass, band pass, and so on. Drive, punch, and key controls. We have our envelope controls for the filter, our amp section, and the one LFO. So if we'd like to apply some modulation to any of these sections, we can just choose the waveform type that we'd like to use. I'll actually leave that on sine. Let's take this rate up a bit. And let's say we'd like to apply that to the pitch. We can come over to the envelope or the LFO here. Now this knob is going to control the amplitude and polarity, as we've seen with a lot of the other instruments. So now when I press a key, let's apply a bit of that to the cutoff, and I'm going to take that off of the pitch. Okay, now up at the top, we've seen the mapping section. We have envelope views here that will tie in with our sections below, the pitch, filter, and amp. So as I make an adjustment to, say, the amp envelope here, we can see that our display will reflect the adjustments that we make. We can also click on these points to make adjustments in the window above here. I'll take that back to the beginning, and let's move on finally to our record section. And this here, we can sample live instruments or vocals or whatever we'd like, and we can set the gate threshold to close and open to give us more control of how this recording process goes. We can choose an input to record from here. We can choose our monitoring controls. By default, this is going to be set to the main out. I'm using a 2-output audio interface, so that's all that I have available. When we click this speaker icon, then we will hear back our signal in our headphones or speakers. Down below, we can choose a name for our sample that we're recording live. We can choose its bit depth or resolution and the insertion key. Okay, so Sample One XT is a pretty cool device, and you can create your own instruments with this, and you can do some interesting sound design. So it definitely would be a good thing to spend some time with it and get familiar with the controls and just experiment and have fun. And that is the last of our included instruments within Studio One 4.